Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute. I will say very little about it today. Some of you have been here to our previous meetings, but we've been going now for 6 years. We're an institute that is, in its ideas and principles, classical liberal in economics, conservative in social and cultural questions, and Atlanticist in foreign policy. But above all, we believe in the importance of debate, discussion, and argument, and we try to bring together differing points of view to test the arguments of all our guests and speakers. Today, I think we are in for a rich intellectual treat. We have two distinguished diplomats on the platform. Our speaker is Todd Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga is a former American diplomat of distinction who has served twice in Brussels at the EU, 3 times in Germany, in Costa Rica, and in several other postings, and most foreign of all, the US State Department. I am delighted to be able to welcome him here, and we look forward to what he has to say. We know the broad outlines of some of the questions he's discussing, which, with the speech of President Macron a few days ago, have become extremely topical and, one might almost say, urgent. And that is the different attitude in world politics, the different stance, the different theory of international relations that is represented by the two halves of the Atlantic Alliance, namely the United States and the European Union. The European Union stands for what is a recent but extremely powerful current of opinion in world politics that believes the traditional Westphalian order of states is past its sell-by date, and that we now need to move towards an international order based on greater equality between states, but in which states yield, nation states in particular, yield many of their powers downwards to organizations of various types of interest groups, ethnic interests, sexual interests, cultural interests involving foreign aid and foreign policy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the state would yield some of its powers upwards to organizations like the European Union, like the several organizations united under the United Nations banner, like NGOs, which have little formal power but enormous influence in what is now known as international civil society. And that's the point of view that is in a sense represented and advanced by the European Union. The other point of view is the traditional view that the basis of international relations is an order of nation states, and that those states are responsible democratically downwards to their electors, and upwards they're united in a fairly modest set of arrangements of international law, with international organizations playing a role in achieving common objectives and reconciling disputes between these countries, but not reaching down into the societies in order to deal with corporations and individuals without the intercession of the nation state. So there are two interesting points of departure here for these two theories of international relations. Mr. Huizinga, no longer at the State Department, but has his own think tank in the United States, and is a prominent advocate of the point of view of national sovereignty. Responding to him later will be a frequent guest, and indeed a member of the Danube Institute family, the former Australian ambassador to the EU, and the former Australian ambassador here to Hungary, who has since made his home in this city, as indeed a number of foreign diplomats tend to do, because it's such an agreeable place to live. So I'm going to ask Mr. Huizinga first to address us. I'll then ask Mr. Higgy to respond. And when he has done so initially, I will, so to speak, manage a conversation between them, raise one or two points before throwing the questions open to you, the audience. And so once again, welcome. And Mr. Huizinga, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Melissa, and Noemi, and Violette, and all of the people from the Danube Institute. I very much appreciate the invitation to speak here, and it's a great honor for me to be here in Hungary. I've only been here twice now, but I love it. It's a beautiful country, and I must say I do also admire you, your courageous stance for your national sovereignty, if I might say, against many of those in the European Union who would prefer that you pool more of your national sovereignty, as they say in Brussels. So in this talk, which is entitled The EU and the United States, Globalism versus National Sovereignty, I would like to focus on what I believe is the central problem in transatlantic relations. This is the problem. We in the West, in North America and Europe, we in the West are now living in a world in which our political differences are no longer based, as they once were, on different perspectives within a shared Western worldview, but rather they are now based on diametrically opposed ideas about first things, about what is good, what is true, and what it means to be human. The premise of a basically unchanging human nature that is embedded in tradition, religion, community, and family, a fundamental component of the Western worldview that has grounded individual freedom and self-government for the past several centuries, this view no longer commands the general allegiance of all Americans or Europeans. Indeed, progressives are now committed to a diametrically opposed view. They are committed to a radically secularist version of the virtually unlimited flexibility of human nature according to each person's choice, each individual or group's choice, essentially independent of traditional institutions and independent of traditional social relations. And every day, both within our countries and in our international relations, we're witnessing the results of these two diametrically opposed worldviews. Once freedom of choice, the belief that we now have on the progressive side of the political spectrum in the West, once freedom of choice, the right to choose, has been exalted above all else, there remain no meaningful limits on the social pressure and governmental power that are now wielded to impose choice on everyone, whether they want it or not. This manifests itself primarily in two ways. First, in the increasing polarization within the nations of the West and the weakening of our democratic freedoms as progressive ideology takes root in our societies. And second, in the conflict between globalism and national sovereignty that is roiling the transatlantic partnership as the struggle intensifies between the EU's globalist vision and America's traditional concern for national sovereignty. So I'd like to elaborate on that in 4 steps. First, I will summarize the domestic situation in the United States. I will talk about the threat to the American experiment in liberty that is posed by the divisive identity politics and political correctness that pit Americans against each other based on race, ethnicity, gender, and any other number of categories. I'll touch upon how identity politics and political correctness are rooted in the postmodern rejection of truth and tradition in favor of postmodernism's idol. Postmodernism's idol being the unlimited right to choose. Second, I'll then discuss the similar challenge that Europeans face, especially in the European Union, how the particularly European vision of world peace through structures of global governance derives from a kind of global political correctness that is also rooted ultimately in the denial of tradition and truth. I will discuss how the new globalist vision of human rights, I'll talk a little bit about human rights, how this globalist vision of human rights ultimately destroys human rights because it denies the truth about human beings. Third, I'll remark on how Donald Trump and today's Hungary and Poland, in their shared insistence on the importance of national sovereignty and Western tradition, have exposed how serious the divide is between conservatives and progressives and between globalism and sovereigntism. I believe that bringing attention to the surface, as has happened because of Donald Trump and because of Hungary and Poland, I believe that bringing the tension between progressivism and conservatism to the surface is a good thing because it forces us to try to deal with the problem. So first, domestic situation in the United States. Second, the situation in Europe. Third, Donald Trump and Hungary and Poland and how that's affecting this thing. And then fourth, and finally, I'll offer my view on perspectives for transatlantic relations. Can we overcome the clash of worldviews between sovereigntist conservatives and globalist progressives that threatens not only our domestic political orders, but also the transatlantic partnership itself? So first, the domestic situation in my home country, the United States. In the United States, our system of self-government is based on the recognition that certain things are unchangeably true, and thus that government must respect these truths in order to be just. As the United States Declaration of Independence expresses, and I quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that to secure those rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." A more profound elucidation of how freedom is anchored in these self-evident truths in the U.S. system can be found in the Federalist Papers, This brilliant series of 85 essays defending the U.S. Constitution was published in 1787 and 1788 in a series during the debate on whether to ratify the Constitution. It's striking if you read the Federalist Papers, and I highly recommend it. It's not difficult reading, actually, even though the ideas that it deals with are very profound. It's striking how deeply indebted the Federalist Papers is to the bedrock assumption of an unchanging truth about human nature. And that truth is this, that human beings, while capable of great good and possessing inalienable dignity, are also flawed and subject to the temptation to abuse power. So each human being dignified, but yet flawed. And the entire U.S. system of government is based on this very sober view of the limits of human nature and thus of the limits of government. This is why the U.S. Constitution establishes separation of powers and checks and balances. Because human beings are unchangeably, unavoidably subject to corruption and abuse of power, the powers of government must be limited and divided into multiple branches so that the flawed human beings who hold governmental power could not impose a tyranny on everyone else. And I would argue that these 18th century views on the essential truths about human nature are still the prevailing instinctive views of most Americans today. However, at the same time, respect for these self-evident truths has lost ground to an unwitting relativism. Without realizing it, and I think that's key, most people don't realize the bases upon which they think. I think that's common to most every person. Without realizing it, many Americans have succumbed to the relativistic worldview of postmodernism, in which truth is no longer authoritative and objective. Instead, truth is in the eyes of the beholder. A kind of trickle-down form of postmodernism has become, for many of us in America, the implicit basis on which we think. Now, what is postmodernism? Well, we could talk about that all afternoon, but let me give you a standard definition. I quote, postmodernism is characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, a suspicion of reason, an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. So this type of subjectivistic relativism, this suspicion that truth is not really truth, but simply a tool to assert power, has seeped into virtually all areas of life. And it is at the heart of the two things that are happening in the United States and the progressive side that are really wreaking havoc in our political culture. It's at the heart of identity politics, and it's at the heart of political correctness. Political correctness and identity politics are really two sides of the same postmodern coin. They both reject the idea that there is any truth claim that can command greater allegiance than the feelings or opinions of any individual or group, especially those individuals and groups that are claimed to be oppressed or disadvantaged. There's no truth except what each person believes is true for him or herself. Reality itself is nothing more than what each individual or group feels it to be. Individual choice and group identity reign, and reality can and must be reshaped, and it is being reshaped in the United States, in the service of individual choice and group identity. And my subjective assessment of what is true for me must be enforced upon the rest of society, because my dignity is violated by anyone who does not accept my decision about what is true for me. If, for example, I am a transgender person, I have the right to deny my actual gender and to force everyone else to treat me in a way that corresponds to my chosen gender identity, regardless of my real gender. Reality is being reshaped because of my individual choice about myself. Or, if I am a man who is in love with another man, I have a right to marry that person and to force everyone else to call it a marriage. If a pregnant woman expects to face difficulties in raising her child after its birth, she can choose not to call him or her a child. She can choose to claim that it is her human right to end another human life. And if I want to seek a better life in another country, then it is xenophobic to support any immigration laws that stand in the way of my right to choose what country I live in. This idea at the core of the progressive worldview, the postmodern worldview, the idea that freedom means the right to disregard truth and to decide for myself what is true, is the complete inversion of the traditional idea, as expressed in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, that freedom must be anchored in real, lasting, and objective truth. And arising out of this inversion of freedom anchored in truth is an inversion of justice. The justice of identity politics is that society at large not only recognize, but also support in language, thought, and legislation each group's self-definition of its tribal truth, and to do so globally without regard for national borders. And that brings me to the second part of the talk, Europe. Europe suffers from this same postmodernist diminishment of truth. In fact, the utopian side of the EU's globalist project of supranational governance, governance by institutions above the nation-state level, supranational, above the nation-state. The utopian side of the EU's globalist project of supranational governance has been fueled by a kind of postmodernism at an international level, a kind of global political correctness. You could put it this way. In the sphere of international politics, the spirit of postmodernism has seized the opportunity presented by the end of the Cold War for new ways of thinking about world order. In the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, political postmodernism has deconstructed and redefined political categories associated with modernity, such as, for example, the nation state, national sovereignty, international law, and human rights. And it's redefined these political categories in order to assert a new post-national view of governance, a view that frees people from their national traditions, national religions, national points of view, etc., in order to assert a new post-national view of governance and a new kind of human rights that corresponds on an international level to identity politics at a national level. So now a little bit about human rights. I could talk about other things, but let me kind of illustrate what I'm talking about with the European Union's kind of globalist postmodernism. Let me illustrate that by discussing human rights in the new globalist point of view. So the new human rights are at the very core of the globalist vision for a world order that animates those who believe that the EU's purpose is to realize world peace as the forerunner of a system of global supranational governance, governance above the national level, modeled on the EU, that based on a growing web of international organizations administering a growing body of international law. And the new human rights in this globalist vision are based, just like identity politics, on a denial of truth. No longer does human rights mean the right to live, speak, and act in accordance with the unchanging truth about human nature, in accordance with that which promotes human flourishing. Rather, human rights now stands for the right to choose above all else, the right to choose one's own personal truth, and thus to be liberated from the truth claims of others while imposing one's truth claim about oneself on everyone else, just like identity politics. And it's very interesting if you look at some of the things that the EU says and tries to do. This so-called right to choose must be enforced by the coercive power of an ever-growing government. And that makes sense. In a world without the authority of objective truth, only those who have political power have authority that is enforceable. In principle, no one who's rejected the idea of objective truth is very far from Mao Zedong's famous dictum that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And not surprisingly, these new human rights downplay the classical rights that protect the individual from government, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of the press, and favors rights that must be enforced by government, such as women's rights, defined as the right to choose an abortion in complete disregard to the unborn infant's right to life, or children's rights, asserted and protected by the state, often against parents. That is a true center of children's rights, by the way, in the vision of the EU, namely that the state is there to enforce children's rights against the parents. Or the right to choose, as I mentioned, one's own sexual and gender identity, and to have that choice supported by everyone else. Or again, unlimited immigrant rights, the right to choose where to live and to be admitted to any country that one chooses, a right that would be enforced, if it were a right, by politically correct governments regardless of the desires of their own citizens. And so with the political redefinition of human rights, the individual's so-called unlimited right to choose actually becomes the unlimited right of the government to decide what must or must not be chosen. So government, as the guarantor of universal human rights, expands to government as master. And in the globalist vision, with the global reach of communications, travel, commerce, and ideas, government as master expands geographically also. And just as government power to determine what human rights are is in principle unlimited, so also it becomes impossible to limit the power of government to a certain geographical area or people. Global supranational governance thus becomes, in principle, I'm talking in principle here, the only rational option. And national sovereignty becomes, in principle, an impermissible limit on the elite's power to decide for everyone else what is just and true. Let me give you an example of the intrusiveness of the globalist project and how it's connected with human rights in naming an example that hits close to home here in Europe. I'm going to now quote what the European Union officially says about the United Nations post-25 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals are right now the ultimate globalist program of the 21st century so far, to develop a world in which development is sustainable, human rights are sustainable, everything good is sustainable. So let me quote from a statement of the EU Council of Ministers that is particularly revealing of how the EU aims to achieve a utopian level of human rights via kind of ill-defined yet all-encompassing structures of global governance. I quote from the EU, and I've got to imagine this includes the Hungarian foreign minister at the time. This is 2015 because these statements have to be approved by all of the foreign ministers unanimously. So I quote, "The post-2015 agenda," in other words, the Sustainable Development Goals, "the post-2015 agenda should therefore integrate the three dimensions of sustainable development in a balanced way across the agenda, ensure coherence and synergies, and address interlinkages throughout the goals and targets. It is also crucial to ensure that the agenda encompasses all human rights and that it respects, supports, and builds on existing multilateral agreements, conventions, commitments, and processes. The agenda should leave no one behind. In particular, it must address, without any discrimination, the needs of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable, including children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities, as well as of marginalized groups and indigenous peoples. And it must respond to the aspirations of young people. We should ensure that no person, wherever they live, and regardless of ethnicity and gender, age, disability, religion or belief, race, or other status, is denied universal human rights." End quote. So you probably lost track of what this statement was saying, but in a certain sense, that was the point I was making, that the view behind the statement is a view of politics or governance that is universal, global, all-encompassing, comprehensive. There are no constraints, no limits, neither geographical nor aspirational. There are no checks or balances to stand in the way of the good that can be accomplished by the global elite. The language here is almost religious, it's almost messianic, ascribing quasi-salvational powers to politics and governance. Clearly, it sets aside the West's traditional Judeo-Christian recognition of human fallibility for the notion that, via activist global governance, the world can be transformed and human beings can be liberated from the constraints of local traditions, cultures, or religions. So that was the United States and the European Union, a summary of kind of what's going on domestically with us and what's going on kind of in the EU's utopian view of globalist governance. So now for my third part. Enter into this situation the election of Donald Trump and the growing populist movements in Europe and the EU's conflicts with Hungary and Poland especially. So how is the sovereigntist conservatism, as represented by Donald Trump and by today's Hungary and Poland, affecting this whole sovereigntist globalist debate? Trump and Hungary and Poland, and by that I do not mean to equate Donald Trump with the government of Hungary or the government of Poland, but I'm talking about the similarity in terms of sovereignty and conservatism. Trump and Hungary and Poland, in their shared insistence on the importance of national sovereignty and Western tradition, have exposed how serious the divide is between conservatives and progressives in the West, and between globalism and sovereigntism, between America in general and the EU in general. Now, many believe, and I'm in Western Europe more often than in Central Europe, so I'm saying this from personal experience. Many believe that Hungary and Poland could tear the EU apart, and many believe that Donald Trump could cripple the transatlantic relationship. But I believe that bringing this tension to the surface between conservatism and progressivism, sovereigntism and globalism, I believe that bringing the tension to the surface is good because it forces us to try to deal with the problem. So let me begin with an overview of Hungary and Poland. And here's the riskiest part of my talk because I'm not from Hungary, and so please forgive me for the inaccuracies that my outsider's analysis probably includes. And please let me know if I'm inaccurate in a certain way. So many Western Europeans ask themselves, why are the Poles and the Hungarians being so difficult? I believe that what many Western Europeans do not fully understand is that the Poles and the Hungarians and the other Central Europeans actually, with their difficult histories of war, occupation, conquest, and communism, have a healthy realist's eye for the hard truths in life and for the limited possibilities of human beings and human government. I believe that the Poles and the Hungarians have a greater sensitivity for the tragic in life, for the fact that great political plans sometimes go the opposite way that they were intended. And I would argue that most Western Europeans do not have as strong a view of the tragic in life. Like my generation in the United States, they've had a very, very good life for many, many years. And so they've lost this kind of natural human sense of the tragic. And now, I believe, I'm going to say something about the Poles and Hungarians here. The Poles and the Hungarians, because of the pressure the EU is exerting against you, are beginning to figure out instinctively, if not always in a way that is easily articulated, what the darker implications of the EU's supranationalism, governance above the national level, the darker implications of the EU's supranationalism. Perhaps the clearest expression of this sentiment, this suspicion that many Poles and Hungarians, and of course I know that your societies are also divided between pro and anti-EU and so forth and so on. But perhaps the clearest expression of this suspicion came in Prime Minister Viktor Orban's speech on October 23, 2016, at the 60th anniversary celebration of the Hungarian uprising of 1956. Comparing the EU's supranational intrusiveness explicitly to the Soviet domination of the time, Orban said, and I quote, "Only our own national independence can save us from the all-consuming destructive appetites of empires. The reason we stuck in the throat of the Soviet Empire was that we asserted our national ideals. This is also why we shall not accept the EU's transformation into a modern-day empire. We do not want them to replace the alliance of free European states with the United States of Europe. Today, the task of Europe's freedom-loving peoples is to save Brussels from Sovietization." End quote. As I understand it, the Orban government, as well as the current Polish government, will not, after having been liberated from a half-century of Soviet domination, submit their countries to a new authoritarian foreign domination that's different, but nevertheless is a type of domination coming from the West. So, why do Hungary and Poland see things as they do? In addition to the sense of tragedy in life, which I mentioned already, I think there are two other main reasons that Poland and Hungary see things as they do. The first is that the governments of Poland and Hungary are conservative. They have a traditionalist understanding of democracy, society, the rule of law, and the other basics of Western political order. And furthermore, they're struggling to put that conservatism, that traditionalist vision of democracy, society, and culture into practice under the shadow of the European Union. And the European Union is anything but traditionalist. The European Union is progressive to its core. Even more than that, really, the European Union, in its ambition to build a new supranational world order, is completely founded not in tradition, but in novelty, in new things, in a rejection of the traditional connection between democracy and the nation state. So for Hungary and Poland, under these circumstances, there are bound to be bumps in the road in the relationship with the European Union. There are bound to be big bumps in the road, as both countries are experiencing. And so from an American point of view a minute, it's a huge problem, actually, in transatlantic relations that the mainstream media in the United States and thought leaders in the United States share the EU's perspective. Not only that, they do not want to understand. They don't want to understand, many of them, Hungary or Poland's perspective. One often notices this even in relatively conservative media. For example, in the Wall Street Journal, there was a 2017 opinion piece by William Galston in the Wall Street Journal, for example, entitled "The Growing Threat of Illiberal Democracy." And it states, I quote, "The most urgent threat to liberal democracy is not autocracy, it is illiberal democracy." And Galston then goes on to spend much of his article branding Poland and Hungary as the primary proponents of this dangerous illiberal democracy, of this thing that is the primary danger to democracy in the West. So illiberal democracy. Now, I don't know how it's phrased in Hungarian, but in English, I think in English translation, the person who is probably the most responsible, who's done more than anyone else in recent times to popularize the term illiberal democracy, is Viktor Orban, beginning with his 2014 speech advocating the development of an illiberal democracy in Hungary. But you know, sometimes it's helpful to actually read a speech before you criticize a speech. And I read the speech in English translation. So what did he mean, if you read the speech, what did he mean by illiberal democracy? He defined liberal democracy as a system informed by liberal principles like those of the postmodern EU and the US under Barack Obama. So liberal in the American sense of left-wing progressive. And he characterized these liberal principles as based on the globalist disregard of the nation state and national interests, and the radically libertine principle disregarding moral considerations. The idea, as I mentioned, to quote him, that you are free to do anything that does not violate another's freedom. And he contrasted these liberal left-wing principles with that which he thought should be the principles of a true democracy, namely love of country and the golden rule. As he put it, I quote, instead the principle should be, do not do to others what you would not do to yourself, the golden rule, as explained to us by Jesus Christ in the New Testament. If one actually takes the time to read Orban's speech, it becomes clear that what Orban was doing was not criticizing liberal democracy as a form of government characterized by free elections, separation of powers, rule of law, and equal protection of civil liberties. Rather, he was criticizing the dominant role in the West of the left wing in the formation of opinion and in policymaking. Orban really wasn't advocating, in English at least, translation, he wasn't really advocating an illiberal democracy. He was advocating a conservative democracy, a traditionalist democracy. So the sense of tragic in life, conservatism. What's the other main reason for Hungary and Poland's conflicts with the EU? The other one, the final one that I'm going to talk about, is the fact that Hungarian and Polish governments stress the importance of Christianity to their societies and to European civilization. And again, this stress on Christianity unites Hungarian, Polish, and American conservatives, but it rubs the radically secular EU the wrong way. In Orban's speech that I quoted earlier, the one on the anniversary of the Hungarian uprising, he also said, and I quote, "There can be no free, strong, authoritative, and respected Europe without the life force of its nations and the 2,000-year-old wisdom of Christianity," end quote. Polish President Andrzej Duda, who was a guest at that event, said in his speech that Poland and Hungary together, I quote, "carry on the 1,000-year-old Christian tradition in Europe." Now, how do progressives in the West and how does the European Union react to such things? Well, as the renowned American analyst George Friedman puts it, I quote, "The insistence by Orban that he is Hungarian first and Christian deeply offends the internationalist and devoutly secular leadership of the EU." And the same goes for the EU's attitude toward the current Polish government. And now, in this mix within Europe, Hungary and Poland and others against the EU, or not against the EU, but against the overweening ambition of the EU. The EU itself could be a good thing. I'll talk about that in a minute. So enter into this mix Donald Trump, whose conservative sovereigntist view of the world, similar in many ways to that of many Hungarians and Poles, has profoundly affected transatlantic relations and profoundly increased tensions between the EU and the United States. Well, why? You could talk about Donald Trump's tweets and you could talk about all the things that he says that no other American president or most other heads of state have ever said. You could talk about all of those things, but let's try to get to the core. U.S. foreign policy before Donald Trump was conducted under the catchphrase, Europe whole and free, U.S. policy toward Europe, Europe whole and free. This phrase was uttered by George H.W. Bush in a speech in Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And ever since then, ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, U.S. policy toward Europe has had this Europe whole and free bias, so to speak. It's had a pro-European Union bias. Implicitly, if not explicitly, implicitly endorsing the supranationalist vision of the EU, and usually doing so unknowingly. Most Americans don't understand the EU. By the way, most Europeans, I don't believe, understand the EU. It's too complex. And again, let me just emphasize: people don't understand the EU not because they're dumb. It has nothing to do with it that they're too dumb to understand the EU. People don't have time to understand the EU. It's too complex. People have their everyday lives to live, for goodness sake. So certainly most Americans, and that includes most Americans in the US government, do not understand the EU. And so we've had this kind of pro-EU bias, in many ways thinking the EU is just a free trade area and cooperation between European countries, when actually it's much more than that. So that's been our policy. But now, with all of the problems in the EU, this American kind of pro-supranationalist bias increasingly fails to fit the times. And Donald Trump has noticed that. Another person who's noticed that is Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. I recommend to you the speech that Pompeo gave in Brussels to an audience of European Union people, stressing the importance of national sovereignty. You should read the speech. So Trump and Pompeo understand that this pro-supranationalist bias that we've had in US foreign policy since 1989 no longer fits the times. They understand that a Europe whole and free glosses over the fact that the EU and the US have fundamentally different visions of the world. The traditional US vision of the world and of international affairs is that of a world of sovereign nations that peacefully cooperate among each other on the basis of their national sovereignty, on the basis of national governments that are elected by their people and that are democratically accountable to their people, and on the basis of governments that recognize their national constitutions or their national basic laws as their supreme law, not international law. And a basic assumption behind this emphasis on national sovereignty is that the existence of nations is an undeniable fact that cannot be erased from politics. Again, I'm talking about unchanging truths about human nature. People just simply do exist within national cultures, national histories, national traditions, and national languages. And this cannot be changed via political projects, such as the globalist supranational project of the EU. And this can be seen, by the way, I've mentioned this, I've alluded to this several times. This can be seen, by the way, in light of what undoubtedly has been the number one political issue here in Europe for at least the past 5 years, and which was also the issue at the center of Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. The right of each country to control its own borders and to formulate its own immigration policy is at the very heart of democratic sovereignty. This does not mean a country is against foreigners, or a country is against refugees or against migrants. It's simply saying that every country has a right to control its own borders and decide on its own immigration policy. And this is a recognition that also unites American and Hungarian and Polish conservatives. So, the Trump presidency and the refusal of Hungary and Poland and many others in Europe to knuckle under to the EU's progressive vision has made the conflict between the sovereigntist United States and the globalist EU more visible. It's made the conflict more acute. It's heightened the conflict. And it appears many times that this clash of visions for world order puts the EU and the US on a collision course, like we're going to run into each other and collide. For a long time, we thought we could ignore it. We thought we could, the Europeans, they like the EU, and we'll just be for a Europe whole and free, and, everything will be fine. We thought we could ignore it. But now we can no longer ignore it. It's obvious that sovereigntists and globalists are on a collision course, and that a full-on collision could severely weaken the transatlantic partnership for a long time to come. So now we must ask, can we avoid the collision? have to say I'm not sure that we can avoid the collision. This is a battle, as I said, involving fundamental commitments, fundamental worldviews. It's not just about differing perspectives within the same Western worldview. And that's the problem. The problem is not Donald Trump. The crisis in transatlantic relations reflects the civilizational crisis of the entire West between the traditional Judeo-Christian belief in truth and the progressivist postmodern idolization of choice. So this crisis is characterized by polities that are divided according to these two worldviews that are in mutual opposition to one another. Now, we could ask the question in a different way, and mainly this last part I'm just asking questions. I'm not saying how are we going to fix the problem. That's a question for a long debate. But another way of asking the question about can we avoid the collision between the EU and the US? And this is an approach that fits the Hungarian context especially. Seems to me to be simply to ask, can the EU be reformed into what most Europeans want it to be? Most Europeans, including Western Europeans, want it to be the following. They want it to be an international organization that fosters close cooperation between its member states, but that respects the full national sovereignty of its member states. Now, I know that Viktor Orban, and I think most Hungarians, I think, believe or hope that the EU can be reformed in this way. And I hope that you're right. And I think that there are many signs that you're right. I mean, populism, as they call it, populism, is increasing around Europe. More and more Western Europeans, for example, the British, are either saying we want out, or they're saying, look, we're Germans first, or Dutch first, or French first, and then we're Europeans. We have nothing against Europe. We love being Europeans, but we're our own nations first. And this is becoming a wave, also in Western Europe, that is becoming impossible to ignore. I mean, if you look at the German Christian Democratic Union, they've been losing votes, losing votes, losing votes. They're in the center right. And they've been losing votes to a large extent to the Alternative for Germany, a new kind of sovereigntist political party that many believe is far right. Well, it's getting to the point where the CDU, with the few votes it's getting, is going to have to either open itself to a coalition with the Alternative for Germany, or it's going to have to go to a coalition not only with the Social Democrats, but also with the Greens, because the Social Democrats are getting fewer and fewer and fewer votes. So, the time of choosing is coming. So maybe the EU will be forced to reform by the peoples of Europe. But what if the EU can't be reformed? Here's my final question. What if the EU can't be reformed, in the worst case? Or what if it can be reformed, but it takes a long, long time before it's reformed? So what do we do while we remain in this transatlantic conflict between sovereigntism and globalism? And what do we do while we seek to shore up, strengthen the transatlantic relationship despite this conflict? I think that conservatives need to take the intellectual lead, and conservatives need to concentrate and develop arguments about the following question. What kind of societies, what kind of governments do we want in the West? This is an important question because I think majorities on both sides of the Atlantic, even many progressives on both sides of the Atlantic who haven't thought through to the consequences of their progressivism, I think most of us still want democracy as we've traditionally understood it in the West. We want democracy characterized by self-government, the rule of law, and the respect for fundamental freedoms. Transatlantically right now, there are huge differences in important particulars of that desire for self-government. And the differences are especially stark between the United States and Western Europe. There's Western Europe's globalist orientation versus the United States' concern shared by Hungary for national sovereignty. That's what I've been talking about the whole time. There's the European social model, so to speak, versus the American social model. There's the more religious America versus a more secularized Europe. And by the way, a more secularized Europe, mainly in Western Europe, but not only in Western Europe, also in Central Europe, is much more secularized than the United States. So these are huge differences. But they don't have to be insurmountable problems, because the basis of good foreign relations is not achieving sameness. I think in a certain sense, the problem with the EU is it wants to achieve sameness in Europe. You know, I was just in Italy. I love Italians, you know. I love Germans. I love Hungarians, you know. I love the countries. Why would we want it to be the same, you know? The purpose of foreign relations is not achieving sameness, but rather it's respecting and striving to understand the diversity of views, cultures, traditions, and languages among the international partners while working together on the political and economic fundamentals. Again, self-government, rule of law, etc. So my hope, and I realize this is very vague, but I think it's maybe the only answer we can come up with right now. My hope is that Hungarian and other European and American conservatives, those who cherish the Western tradition, can take the intellectual lead and stay firm in the struggle to renew this civilizational commitment to the fundamentals, because it's a commitment that can no longer be taken for granted. We need to renew our commitment, our society's commitment to these fundamentals. And thereby, hopefully, we can help the alliance between Europe and North America not only to survive this cultural crisis, but if a healthy debate increases our health, maybe it can help us emerge from this time of cultural trial a stronger alliance than we were before. Let's hope that can be the case. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. Thank you. First of all, Todd, let me just repeat what I was saying, namely that I think that was an extraordinarily important speech. I think we have a distinguished audience here, and there will be different points of view, so we will thrash them out in a moment. I particularly want to recognize, by the way, if I may, in the audience, if I could recognize the former foreign minister of Hungary, János Martonyi, who is, I might say, in addition to a distinguished academic and political career, is also a godfather of the Danube Institute. So welcome to us. Before I throw open the debate to the floor, I'm going to ask Mark Higgy if he would to respond to the remark, the speech he's heard, and then we'll have a wider debate. Thank you very much.
Hello? Yes. Is that working? Well, Todd, thank you very much indeed for a terrifically rich and interesting presentation. I won't take up too much time, but I thought I'd just make a few comments on a few reactions. What you were saying towards the beginning about postmodernism, political correctness, and the rejection of truth reminded me of a terrific presentation that I went to in London 2 weeks ago by Douglas Murray and Lionel Shriver, a Spectator event on the question of identity politics. And by the way, in that context, I must pick you up on a heinous error you made. You made a reference at one point to pregnant women. And one of the things that we learnt at that event in London is that it's not pregnant women, it's pregnant persons. Absolutely. Absolutely. A number of other wonderful things were learnt that evening, including somebody in the audience who said that they'd been filling out a British government form, and when he got to the point of gender, there were 12 options. And the other memorable moment was that apparently the London Underground has been forced by the transgender activists to drop the reference to ladies and gentlemen. That is deeply unacceptable these days. But
They say now instead of
well, I don't know. I think probably nothing. But this is the sort of madness that is going on. But I just make the comment in that area. You were referring to the post-modernism trend affecting the whole of the West. As an Australian, I would make the comment that, in fact, the worst offenders when it comes to all of this stuff, the identity politics, the gender fluidity and all the rest of it, the worst are the English-speaking countries. I would say that continental Europe is sort of marginally less advanced in that direction than Britain, Australia, the United States, Canada. But just quickly on the substance of your remarks, I agreed absolutely with everything you had to say about Hungary and where it stands in relation to its European Union membership. I find it interesting to contrast, on the one hand, Hungary and Poland, and on the other hand, Britain, in their reservations about the whole EU project. All three countries share a worry about the ambitions of the EU in terms of eroding national sovereignty. The difference is that the Hungarians and the Poles take the view that an assertive position within the European Union is the right one for them, and there is a genuine hope here that in the fullness of time that the EU's ambitions will, can be restrained. The contrast, of course, is Britain, where essentially, it's now clear that Britain was happy with membership in a bloc that provided free trade and the single market, but when it came to the Maastricht Treaty and everything that followed in terms of the movement towards sovereignty sharing, to use, or pooling, to use that term, now basically a majority of the population was left behind, profoundly skeptical about all of that, and hence we had the Brexit vote. In that area, President Obama, you'll remember, visited Britain in the lead up to the Brexit vote, and urged Britain to remain in. And I remember the commentary coming after this about how extraordinary it was that the United States was urging Britain to remain part of this supranational organisation. And the question was asked, how many Americans would accept their judges or senior officials being overruled by judges or from Latin America, for example? The answer is very zero, and you can say the same thing about Australia, that there are profound differences there with the whole experiment. I mean, I did have the thought that even though the EU embodies ambition towards the erosion of national sovereignty in a supranational structure, it's not exactly a trend which is sweeping the world. I mean, there is the EU is in many ways unique. I mean, we can talk about the United Nations, I suppose, but in terms of a group of countries that have accepted serious limitations on their sovereignty, the EU is an unusual experiment. And the question is, I suppose, how sustainable it is. In recent years, it all seemed as if it was going to go on forever, but the migration crisis several years ago was one clear area where many of the members of the Union were deeply concerned that the efforts to control member states' migration policies, population policies, was simply a step too far, and if that comes to the fore again, you could see the EU running into serious problems in terms of its ambition. I think I just thought I'd mention that both of us have had the experience of negotiating with the European Union in Brussels over, in our case, a free trade agreement, and in your case also. And it is very, very striking that the EU has got into the habit of adding all sorts of non-trade issues, which have the effect of making progress extremely slow. I mean, at one point, we couldn't even get to the beginning of negotiating a free trade agreement because the EU insisted that if they had any concerns about human rights issues in Australia, the whole process would come to an immediate halt with no prospect of restarting. And I notice they've just said also that they will hold us to the highest standard when it comes to climate change issues. And should we fall short of the golden EU standard, again, this will mean a cessation in progress. I might just stop there, and but might add further thoughts as we go through the talk. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. Before I throw it open at the floor, I have one clarificatory question to Todd, and that's this. His remarks on illiberal democracy. I actually, shortly after Viktor Orban made the famous speech that he did, I ran into him at a lunch, and I said to him that I'd read the speech, but I didn't think he was advocating illiberal democracy. I said he was attacking undemocratic liberalism, and I think that was an argument which he accepted, and once or twice later in interviews he made that point. But the question then is, if we think of the debate over democracy, liberal or illiberal, is the point at which there are so many other organizations, courts, international bodies, even domestic bodies that are given powers of supervision over people and institutions. I mean, for example, in Britain, local government officials can forbid councillors from debating issues if they think they have a conflict of interest. Rather than simply declaring the conflict. If we think that there is, so to speak, an argument is, when does a democracy become become illiberal, so to speak, or rather, when does it become too liberal? What is the point at which we feel that no longer elected democratic representatives are making decisions? They're being made by so many other institutions and individuals that democracy has ceased to have any real force. Because that, it seems to me, is a practical question, since we'll never have perfect democracy and we'll never have a perfect liberal order either.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the loss of, is it on? I hate it when people are up in front and they ask, is the microphone on? But I had to ask, so. I think that, that's an incredibly important question, but a very, very difficult question to answer in real life, because what happens is, at least if I observe what's going on in the United States, and I think this fits also with kind of the European Union's gradual assertion of more and more power. It happens on little cat feet, so to speak, right? The loss of freedom kind of comes on little cat feet, and it's one thing after another. And when the one thing happens, like for example, so obviously I see a loss of freedom in the United States from the point of view of a conservative traditionalist who is a Christian with Orthodox Christian theological beliefs. That, of course, means marriage between a man and a woman, etc. So from my point of view, what happens is that even when the one thing happens, it just happens a little bit. It isn't all of a sudden imposed. So slowly, more and more people start talking about marriage equality, which is what gay marriage is now referred to in the United States. And kind of impugning the moral character and the right to speak of those who believe in traditional marriage. And then, of course, the very term marriage equality is a term that is very appealing. It appeals to what people believe in. They believe in equality, equal rights, marriage equality. And it totally, again, distracts from the real issue. Namely, the real issue is, what is marriage? What is the purpose of marriage? Not what is marriage equality, for goodness sake. What is marriage? So it distracts from the real issue and paints the new way of seeing things as being the side that's for equality. And slowly, more and more people start to believe this. More and more people start to see people who believe in traditional marriage as bigots. More and more people who believe in traditional marriage feel constrained to censor themselves in public because they don't want to be seen as bigots. And very slowly, this one issue becomes an issue on which people lose their freedom to believe what they believe and to advocate that in the public square. And then you notice, you think, wow, this sounds like something that religious conservatives are worried about and no one else. Well, but it's about a basic view of what human beings are, for goodness sake. And suddenly, on little cat feet, the traditional view, and the correct view, if I may say, about what human beings are, what it is to be human, is no longer allowed to be discussed in the public square. And the wrong view is imposed. And this happens issue by issue, and with each issue gradually, and at different times. So, when is the end? It's very hard to tell. One final comment on how things can creep up, though. You may have heard that a Democratic presidential candidate, Beto O'Rourke, was asked, before he dropped out of, he's no longer in the presidential race, but when he was a candidate still, Beto O'Rourke was asked whether churches in the United States should be allowed to hold their tax-exempt status unless they supported gay marriage. And he basically said, we are not going to give tax-exempt status to anyone who doesn't believe in marriage equality for all. And so what happened was a candidate for the presidency of the United States said that I am against religious freedom. It was basically what he was saying. I am against religious freedom. And that is very, very concerning. And it happens without people noticing.
I'm now going to throw open the discussion to the floor, and would anyone like to ask the first question? Sorry, a gentleman over there, then a gentleman there, and was there another? Oh,
yes,
sorry.
I thank you very much for an
in reverse order in that
yeah.
case.
I thank you very much for an excellent analysis. I had my college education in the States in the 60s. And it was this relativism was starting to creep in. Already they told us that the villages in the swamps and stills in Papua New Guinea is equal to Venice buildings and whatnot. And I saw from that time that this liberal views started to creep in like a cancer. And no one seemed to address it. No one seemed to counter it. And I hope that this way, for example, in the EU, there doesn't seem to be any checks and balances to these people who are making this agenda. And I'm glad to hear that there are intellectual and ideas that are going to address this. Thank you.
Before you answer that point, because let me just put this to you. The questioner referred to liberal and liberalism. Is that the word you would use, or is the word progressive a better one or a worse one?
Yes, thank you for your comment. I really appreciate that. I'm now using the word progressivism because, but not out of some sort of scientific way of thinking about it really, just simply because I associate liberalism, let's say, with John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. You know, it kind of started in the 60s, as you were saying, but still, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Democrats in general were liberals. And by liberals, I mean, so this is just my personal view, by liberals, I mean people who hold to a Western worldview, like conservatives do, but they have a different perspective on what the political solutions are in order to make a better America or a better Europe. To me, those are liberals. Whereas progressives are people who believe that human beings need to progress beyond the Western tradition, which is authoritarian and fundamentalist and against minorities and just wrong. And we need to move beyond that to a place where we can all decide for ourselves what's true, which is obviously we should all be able to decide for ourselves everything. We have the right to choose everything. So that to me is progressivism as opposed to liberalism.
David Cadesta, Central Europe Trust. Thanks very much for your speech, very interesting. The European Parliament is obviously elected by citizens throughout the EU. The Commission is appointed by governments, obviously. Commissioners are appointed by governments throughout the EU. You spoke about, creeping by cat's feet. How have we got to this point of disconnect between at least some of the governments in the EU and the Commission, given this democratic framework? And perhaps is there a more direct democratic framework and voting framework that could be used to bridge the disconnect? Thank you.
I guess I would say, so how did we get to this point where we have, in a certain sense, a deeply, or an EU, let's put it politely, we have an EU with a serious democratic deficit. How did we get to that point? Since, there are kind of democratic structures, such as the European Parliament being directly elected, the Commission being appointed by national governments that are elected, the Council of Ministers made up of members of elected national governments and so forth. How did it come to be undemocratic? I'd say for several reasons. One is that the EU is in essence a utopian political project. Now, I want to emphasize that there are many, many, many people in the EU, many people in Brussels, who don't believe in utopian supranationalism as I was describing it. They believe in closer cooperation among Europeans. I'm saying that the EU is a utopian political project, not in the sense that every single person in the EU believes in that, but in the sense that the EU's reason for being. I mean, if you read some of what the founding fathers of the EU said, Monnet and Schuman and Adenauer and so forth, a lot of people like to contrast the undemocratic EU with the founding fathers. I would kind of humbly assert that actually the founding fathers of the EU started the EU on its utopian journey because they were talking about world peace and all of these very wonderful, be great to have world peace, but it's utopian. It's never going to happen because human beings aren't that way. So the motor behind the EU is utopian. And when you're utopian, you are changing the world. You're making the world an undeniably better place. You can't let the voters stand in your way, for goodness sake. And so, if there's a referendum in Ireland, well, first Denmark, if there's a referendum in Denmark that kind of puts a break in it, we're just going to have the Danes vote again so they get it right, which they then did. If there's a referendum in Ireland, we're going to have to get the Irish to get it right, which they then did. If there's a second referendum on a second treaty in Ireland and they get it wrong again, they're going to have to re-vote so they can get it right, and then they did. If the French and the Dutch have a referendum and decide we don't want the EU Constitution, well, we better be careful about offending the French and the Dutch because they're part of the 6 founding members. So what we'll do is we'll get together and we'll make a treaty that's basically the EU Constitution, and we'll pretend we respected what the French and the Dutch said, but actually we've got the Constitution, it's just named a treaty. So you can see how the utopian nature of the EU means we need to override the will of the voters because we are building a new world. That's one reason. Another reason is the distance, I think, between voters and the EU. Now, in the United States, in Europe, probably most other places, many, if not most people, already have 3 levels of government that they have to deal with. They have the local level, then they have the regional level, like in the United States, a state of the union, or let's say in Germany, a Bundesland, right, the different states within Germany. So you have the state level, the regional level, local level, regional level, and then the national level. So here you are, working for your money, taking care of your family, wanting to have fun every once in a while, etc. And you've already got to know enough about 3 levels of government to be able to vote for them. It's too much to expect of people to then know what's going on Europe-wide and what the issues are Europe-wide and what exactly it is you're voting for at a European level to actually have a democracy. It's asking too much of people. And again, let me emphasize, as I said during my speech, the fact that people don't know what the European Union is does not mean they're dumb. It means they've got no time to worry about yet another level of government over them, especially one that is so complex and so convoluted as the European Union. This is my, believe it or not, humble view on that. So it's the utopianness, it's the distance, and then I mentioned also the complexity. I don't think most people know what they're voting for when they vote for members of the European Parliament. So you could ask the question, is it really democratic just because people vote if they don't understand what they're voting on? This is an important question for the European Parliament. The European Parliament is not really a parliament, right? It doesn't make laws like most parliaments do. The Commission has the right of initiative to initiate legislation, and the Parliament approves those laws, but it doesn't make laws except in very general suggestions. It doesn't have an opposition and a government party like most parliaments have because there is no government and no opposition in the EU. So how do you understand what a member of the European Parliament that you're voting for really does? Very difficult.
Next question. A gentleman there. Please take the microphone.
Thank you very much. Paul Meze, I'm a chemist and mathematician, so my biases will be showing. I have actually 2 comments. I find it fantastically powerful what you said, and I liked very much the comment about truth, because I think that truth is in terrible danger in the public and media especially. Media is an enemy of democracy, in my opinion, today. And the problem is this truth. Many perceive truth as being undemocratic because there's no opposition to truth. And come on, how can it be? That's a terrible thing. And about the PC extreme model, I want to say, extreme model about PC, political correctness is all numbers are created equal. We are getting to this point, unfortunately.
Yes, I agree with you completely. And I want to give another aspect of the truth about human beings as understood in the Judeo-Christian West that is absolutely necessary, it seems to me, to have a sustainable democracy. And that truth is kind of that central insight about human beings that I was talking about in the Federalist Papers. That human beings, on the one hand, all possess inviolable and equal dignity, the good side. The bad side, all human beings are flawed and subject to the temptation to abuse power, so we have to limit the powers of government and divide them. That obviously, I mean, you can express it, as I just did, in a secular way. But it obviously comes from the Christian view of the human being, We have equal and inviolable dignity because we are all made in the image of God. And we are flawed because we are all sinful. And, of course, what many non-Christians don't realize is that if we're Christians, we know we are all sinful, including Christians. Christians are not better people than other people. They're simply people who believe in the Christian gospel. So here's the value of that. One, it gives us a sustainable structure for democracy. In other words, limited government, checks and balances, that speaks to the flawed side of human nature, but the fundamental freedoms that speak to the dignity side of human nature. But here's another thing. The Judeo-Christian view of the human being leads to real tolerance. Why? Because I know I'm flawed, and I know everybody else has inviolable dignity that I cannot call into question. So, my political enemies are not my enemies. They're other human beings who have inviolable dignity just like I have. And I have to remember that I'm flawed and subject to the temptation to make generalized statements about people who disagree with me. And so I need to be tolerant in a democratic way because of my view of human beings.
Yes, Mr. Deccani. And I'm sorry, first this gentleman who was...
Well, without being too pedantic, I just want to offer that progressivism is something we've had at least since World War I, and it was to the left of liberalism in the United States. The progressives were the fellow travelers, extreme left, not always front organizations, but they really believed that they were something to offer. Now, liberalism, of course, then became even stronger after World War II. The establishment was liberal, whether Democratic or Republican, and they have, in the previous 30, 40 years, more or less taken over the educational system, especially in the Ivy League schools, and to a large extent the media also. I mean, this is sort of basic stuff. And then here we are today, going forward, we have what I call the totalitarians of the new age coming out of the liberal system, coming out of the progressive education, coming out of the best schools, and so on, and now having their crusade for the environment, for transgenderism, or whatever you like. They're right to do so, but they're totalitarian because they would deny the right to others to think and say what they want. And what has also happened is that there's been no resistance, or hardly any. And this is a major fault for, let's say, our civilization. And where it will end, I'm not sure, but one reaction so far has been popularism, or populism, as you like, maybe flawed in many ways, but it's a reaction from people who don't like their civilization being eroded. Not necessarily intellectually, but they feel that there's something wrong here, and they don't want it.
Thank you very much. Almost 20 years ago, an expert whose name is Bob Kagan wrote an interesting article in Washington about Venus and Mars that caused an enormous uproar, not only in the US, but in Europe as well, that put out an equation. Do you think that equation is still valid, or it's somehow transformed? And if so, what can we hope for the future of the transatlantic relationship? That's the first point. The second one, if you make conferences in Belgium or in West Germany, what's the reaction of the public of your speech? Thank you.
I didn't understand the one word. There was a word I didn't understand that you used. Is equation?
Yeah. There was Venus and Mars, and that the context is different now to some extent. The differences are different, or the same. To what extent are the same the differences? To what extent they are different? And what can we hope for the future?
Yeah. I guess. I mean, I think that it is kind of the central problem in transatlantic relations that our differences, at least between Western Europe and the United States, have become so great. And I describe that as kind of progressivism as opposed to conservatism. And that's been exacerbated by the fact that the United States is also secularized quite extensively in the past 30 years, and that progressivism has arisen out of liberalism, as you say, and kind of transformed liberalism. And so we've got the same problem domestically in every country, but kind of newly, we have the problem in the United States. And so that is the central problem. And so, yes, that is the question. Can we continue a good transatlantic relationship with all of these differences seemingly growing and also affecting us within our own polities? And I guess that I am putting my hope in the fact that international relations have never been about making different countries the same, but it's rather been the attempt to understand each other, understand the differences, and work together on the things that are common to us. And then I also put my hope in the fact that most progressives, really, they don't understand what the logical consequences of their worldview are. They still basically want, I think most of them, democracy and freedoms and all of those things. So we can put our hope in the fact that most people don't understand the logical consequences of their worldview, and they still want the same thing. So I really do believe that we need to concentrate on those basics: self-government, rule of law, the fundamental freedoms, free markets, and I mean, I don't want to go into the whole free trade thing with Donald Trump, excuse me. All of those things, free markets, et cetera, we need to concentrate on those things. And here's kind of an interesting little thing that I think is still the case. Another diplomat, a colleague of mine, once said that he thought one reason that there were so many tensions between the US and Europe is because we're so close to each other. In the sense that if you take, middle C on the piano, and then you take the next key, the black key, C sharp, and you push them together, that's the most dissonance that you can possibly get in music, the closest tones. And so I think in many ways, we're so close, we share the same civilizational heritage, that we expect each other to be the same when we're not. And that's something that we always kind of need to remember. We're not the same, we shouldn't expect to be the same. Let's work together on the fundamentals.
I think I'm going to take two questions, then I'm going to invite both speakers to answer them, but also to wrap up their final remarks. And we're already overrunning late, but we have an opportunity next door to meet the speakers at a reception. So the gentleman there, and where was the other speaker? Yes, I think the gentleman there. So the two of those, and then we wrap up.
Well, it's been an honor and privilege to listen to your incredible analysis of all three of you. I'm Tibor Lengyel from Austria and Hungary. I'm a leader of a small research center in Austria in the area of migration and welfare policies, as well as adjunct professor at a couple of Hungarian universities here. And just would make 2 points to what has been said basically by all three of you: the role of human rights and the role of international institutions. I've been researching global governance for the past 15 years. And as a more security policy vocabulary would say, in 2001, they weaponized passenger airplanes, yeah? I think I would say that currently what is going on in a political process context is weaponizing human rights, weaponizing jurisdictional concepts of international organizations, and weaponizing social processes like migration. And all these, and one could go on in a broader spectrum, naming areas, all are taking us to higher and higher level that you pointed out in terms of the weakness of the EU parliamentary democratic system. And actually, they also expand the arguments for global governance. The word comprehensive that you use, this comprehensive agenda, it's a vision, it's a faith, it's a religion, which doesn't know boundaries. It is not limited by the 3 branches of government. It is not limited by local, regional, or national true democratic processes, but actually finds the illegal opt-out clauses for these processes to go on. And here is Mr. Ambassador Higgins' point on the end. Are we going to have a slowly to keep the EU in that form, or are we going to have a more clearer confrontation? Are we facing a clearer confrontation? And just my surmise is, since some brilliant commentators said it's been going on since the beginning of the century, I don't really see how just the time will help without serious confrontation. Thank you.
Hello, Cyril Mook from the Budapest Times. You made a very interesting dichotomy between the USA and the European Union. On the one hand, we had the conservative supporters of national sovereignty. On the other hand, we had this, let's say, multicultural postmodernism globalists in Europe. And then also you spoke about Jean Monnet and the founding fathers. And I just read a book from the French author Philippe de Villiers, where he describes how much these founding fathers were very much supported by American governments at this time. And that then also you said, for example, that the American media is very much understanding the side of the European Union. So I'm always wondering how much maybe the globalist agenda was not originally very much also an American agenda. Thank you very much.
Well, look, I just a couple of quick thoughts. I was most interested in what Todd said about the EU project being utopian to the extent of its advocates having some degree of contempt for democratic votes which impede its forward momentum. The only thing I'd say about that is that, and this is in the spirit of skepticism possibly about the EU's future prospects, is that since the Great Migration Crisis of 2015, virtually every election, whether it's whether it was the EU Parliament, national elections, local elections, has seen the advance of more sovereigntist parties and really the very lackluster performance of those European parties that live the dream of the European project. And it's a big question, you know, where the whole project goes in future. You know, there's a big question, for example, about France, you know, which where Macron is doing very badly, and there's, you know, the distinct possibility that that Le Pen might get there, and you know, what would that mean? And I'll just finish with the thought that it occurs to me that one of the minefields in all of this is that even within the English-speaking world, we use terms differently in different countries. Liberalism, progressivism, all the rest of it. There's the lovely story of my former boss, Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who was, when he was in when a member of Parliament fairly early on, went to Washington and to have a program, and a fairly junior American member of the Australian Embassy in Washington was told that Mr. Abbott was a liberal and a deeply committed anti-Republican, with the result that he had a week's meeting with, as he described it, communists.
Are you a communist? No. That was a joke, thank you. So yeah, Mark, thanks. That's, there's so many complications that are interesting on these things. And also, I agree. Who knows? The EU might well be forced to reform by this populist upsurge that's happening in Western Europe, where people are saying, look, we're not going to take this anymore. I hope. I don't know. I think one thing that is often done with the EU is that people underestimate the power of dreams, the power of the belief that I am working for a better world. There have been many times, for example, the revolution of 1917, right, and what became the Soviet Union, where a majority who believed it was working for a minority that believed it was working for a better world took over because they were more determined, they were more motivated, and they were more ruthless than the others. And I think we need to remember that those in Europe who believe in a new supranational world believe they're working for the betterment of human beings, of mankind, humankind. Can't say mankind anymore either. Humankind. And that is very powerful, even if it probably is, even within the EU, a minority view. Thank you for the last two comments. Excellent. Weaponizing human rights, and the other, I can't remember the other two things, but they were right on line. And the need to engage in this debate. And that's exactly what I meant to say at the end, is that what we need to do is we need to engage in the debate. Because, again, it's a minority that's pushing these progressive views. But they're very intelligent, kind of weaponizing, while at the same time, the way they weaponize it, the way they act smartly, fits with their worldview. Namely, the higher up it is, the more distant from real people, the better it is, because it's going to promote global governance. And so you've got a very powerful minority of people. Powerful because they hold many of the chairs in academia throughout the world. They run the largest NGO, the largest non-governmental organizations throughout the world, and they run the bureaucracies, the UN bureaucracy, the EU bureaucracy. If I may say it, the United States bureaucracy, to a large extent, is run by people who believe in this vision. And so we need to engage. And we need to engage without fear of being marginalized. I think that's why a lot of people don't engage. And we also need to engage firmly, but yet compassionately. These people are not our enemies as people. They are our enemies in the sense that they have a political vision that is against the good of the world. And so they're political adversaries, I guess would be a better way to say it, but they're not our enemies. We need to engage strongly, but with a sense that we respect the humanity of everyone. This has happened to me a number of times where, I've happily spent a lot of time talking about Europeans and this and that, and then someone points out, wait a minute, what about the United States? Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And you're absolutely right. The United States was very much encouraging this whole thing with the European coal and steel community and the idea of European integration. And it's just another example of how in foreign policy, the needs of the moment very often eclipse longer range interests, because the needs of the moment are always so incredibly urgent and cost so much energy. And the need of the moment was, for the United States, we didn't want to send our soldiers over to Europe again after having done it twice and have thousands of young Americans die and, leave widows and orphaned children and parents without their children and so forth. And so we, like everyone, were frantically searching for a way to build a world order that would prevent war in Europe from happening again. Now, and on the EU side, this is something that every critic of the EU needs to remember, that the process of European integration gained steam. It existed, of course, way before the mid-20th century, but it gained real political steam after World War II, which was also basically immediately after World War I. And everyone who criticizes the EU must remember how understandable and noble a vision it was after World War II to try to figure out some way to prevent more war, death, and destruction in Europe. And yes, the United States did have a lot of, was very strongly pushing the Europeans. And yes, all of the problems that we have in Europe in terms of the progressive ideology exist very strongly in the United States as well. And that's just another way, I think, that North Americans, Australians, New Zealanders, et cetera, and Europeans, we're all in this together because we all kind of suffer from the same problems. We all have the same advantages in many ways because we all share that same Western tradition.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to say this has been an extraordinarily interesting afternoon's discussion and debate. It hasn't gone exactly in the way that I thought it would, in the sense that I expected there'd be greater emphasis on disputes across the Atlantic and other technical questions. But we have in fact gone to in a sense, we've plumbed the civilizational arguments as well, and done so, I think, in an atmosphere of genuine, a mixture of amity on the one hand and serious intellectual investigation on the other. I'd like to thank Mark, as always, a reliable, provocative interrogator. I'd like to thank the audience who asked good questions. I think my message is going out that I've got to come back with other conferences on the meaning of words like liberalism, progressivism, and indeed I would add to those Christian democracy, because it seems to me that the notion of Christian democracy it must be seen as being in a crisis after today's discussion. And we wouldn't be doing this if we hadn't had an absolutely first-class speech, very profound, very interesting, never losing my attention or our attention for one moment from Todd, and I'd like to thank him very warmly indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, the reception is in that direction.